Welcome to the Team Teach podcast. I'm Claire, and in each episode you'll find me talking with an expert guest to learn more about behaviour. We squeeze a lot into each episode. You'll listen to the latest thinking in behaviour, continue your professional development with our book recommendation, and then I'll send you away with 3 practical tips you can use in your setting. I'm joined today by Lynn McCann. Lynn is an autism, ADHD and PDA specialist teacher based in Lancashire. She's the author of 5 books for teachers and loves working with young people to enable their voice to be heard in their educational support. Lynn delivers training for schools, charities, parent groups, churches and businesses. And today, Lynn and I are talking about supporting individuals with a pathological demand avoidance in your setting. Enjoy the episode. Hi Lynn, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. It's really nice to have you on the podcast today. We're talking about supporting individuals with a pathological demand avoidance profile. Little bit of a mouthful for a title, but I got it without stumbling over my words. I wanted to start off the episode by thinking about a reflective question. What you wish you knew then that you know now about our topic?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I've actually been interested in the topic since I worked in a specialist autism school about 15 years ago, and curiosity about why some children didn't quite fit what we were doing and not responding to what we're doing. So I wish I'd known then more about how pathological demand avoidance, or PDA as we call it, affected people who were non-verbal for a start, but also looking more generally on the kind of autism and ADHD spectrum. I wish I'd known a lot more about girls then, and masking and those kind of issues that are really big hot topics right at the moment. It would have helped me a lot, but I've learned a lot since then.
Well, yeah, I love that question because hindsight is such a wonderful thing. And I think you're so right about our knowledge base and even the evidence theories that are written about girls and women with autism now. It's a completely different shift. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's more needed, obviously, in the area. But yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. And, also, when we're looking at PDA itself, it's still a developing idea and a condition. So it started off with Elizabeth Newsom in the 1980s and noticing similar things to a lot of teachers say that they had children who had maybe an autism diagnosis or even an ADHD diagnosis at times, or other things that just seem to find everyday things really, really difficult to deal with. So we're still developing our ideas around it, and there are criteria being put together by professionals, but there's still a work in progress. So it's going to be an interesting conversation as we look at what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, forever, not forever changing, but developing kind of area. It would be interesting to see even where we're at now, because it would have changed from when I might have looked at some of the information on it. So yeah, it's going to be a good one to delve into. Just thinking about that and the research and what's out there, what was your book recommendation on this topic?
So the 2 books I usually recommend to teachers are the Collaborative Approaches book by Phil Christie and Ruth Fidler, because they were the main approaches that I first learned about, and they're the main kind of researchers in this area. Claire Truman's book, she is a practitioner who has worked with children who are not in school and who are in school to produce educational programs for them. Very project-based, which is a PDA thing, really. So they're really good books for teachers because they're about the practical things you can do in the classroom. And I'm going to share some of those things as we go through the talk today.
It's going to be such a practical episode and super helpful for everyone listening. I think a good starting point is just thinking about your experience with the topic, so the listener has a really good understanding of where you're at with your experience.
Yeah, well, I mentioned I was worked in an autism specialist school, but for the last nearly 10 years now, I've been an independent specialist teacher. So I travel around to lots of different schools, mainstream and special, and support teachers in supporting their autistic children. So every now and again, we'll come across a child who, again, doesn't seem to respond to the usual autism support strategies. They're often very distressed. Their behaviour can seem all over the place, a lot of meltdowns, sometimes quite a lot of oppositional behaviour, but at other times very withdrawn behaviours. And we kind of need to, the child might already have an autism diagnosis, they might have an ADHD diagnosis or no diagnosis at all. And everybody's scratching their heads wondering what's going on, because whatever they try, which is good autism practice, it just seems to make the child feel more anxious and more resistant. And then you'll have days where they just come in and they'll do anything. And it's that conundrum and that kind of perplexing kind of situation that starts now me thinking, well, we need to look at that PDA profile. And we use the word profile because I'm not a diagnostic, able to diagnose this, but also because there is no absolute agreement on what PDA is diagnostically. There'll be professionals who say, well, it doesn't exist because it's not in the DSM or the ICD. And there'll be others who have taken this on board because they recognise that there are enough children struggling in this way or who have this profile in order for us to be able to put the right support in place. So it is complex. And I would say, it's very easy to think any child who's been resistant or oppositional or kind of demand avoidant, as it's all about, has a PDA profile. But there's a lot more to it than that, and we've got to be a bit cautious.
I think we do have to be cautious, don't we? Because it can be a phrase or a sentence that's banded around. And I think I sometimes liken it to when people talk about, they're a bit OCD, or I'm a bit OCD, or they're a bit PDA, and sort of banding out these phrases, perhaps without having a complex understanding about what it means to use those phrases. I just wanted to come back to one point about the DSM and the ICD, just to check my understanding, and that would be the kind of bodies that look after official, in inverted commas, diagnostic criterias and things that a doctor, for example, or a practitioner could label someone with that criteria or that diagnosis.
Yeah, so they're the official clinicians' handbooks, if you like.
Fab. And then the other question I had, just to really start us off, is what is pathological demand avoidance? And I know that's going to be really hard to answer from what you said already, and where its roots originated from. And then I'm going to throw in an additional question that you probably cognitively can't handle, is what's the difference between that and oppositional defiance disorder? So that's three prongs, going in hard today, Lynn.
That's right. If you have to remind me if I miss one. I'm going to start with pathological demand avoidance, as I said earlier, came from Elizabeth Newsom in the 80s. In the last 10 years, 15 years or so, it's become more prominent because probably most of the work done by the PDA Society, which has loads of really good, helpful resources, they've kind of focused on it being part of the autism spectrum, but that again is being challenged, and people are looking at it as maybe part of the ADHD spectrum and connected to other things. So that's an ongoing debate, but they have put together some really helpful, what we call key features. So instead of diagnostic criteria, there are these key features. So the first one is about resisting and avoiding the ordinary demands of life. Now, again, that can be any kind of child who seems oppositional or demand avoidant or resistant, but here's an example of how it can be different in PDA and, say, autism or ADHD. Let's say you ask your child to get dressed ready for school in the morning, and they resist that. They demand, they are avoiding that demand in whatever way, by either ignoring you, by going off and doing something else, or by out and out having, saying no, or really, really struggling and having a meltdown. So if we look at that through an autism lens, we might have a child who's struggling with the transition. to school. We could have a child who's struggling with the sensory issues around the uniform that they're wearing, or they could be just tired, and might have communication differences. So it's difficult for them to say that actually they don't feel like going to school today. So the resistance comes from their autism needs, and actually we could help them through making a structure that they could go through, breaking the tasks down, giving them more time to get used to the transition, shift their attention to it, and so on. If a child has ADHD, it could be a simple thing like their executive functions aren't working very well that morning, so their brain doesn't enable them to work out, well, what do I do first and then what do I do, and it's all too much, and so they're resisting that. And also school for them might be really boring, they don't want to go. So yeah, that's a reason behind that demand avoidance. Also, kids with ADHD often have really low self-belief, and therefore getting up and going into school, well, I'm going to be rubbish again today, and they're going to be horrible with me, and why bother? So there's all those reasons that you can embed in those conditions. However, a child with a PDA profile often will want to do the thing that you're asking them to do. They're often capable of doing it. They have the functioning to do it, but something in their brain causes like a panic attack at the thought of a demand. And therefore, the resistance just comes internally like a huge flash of panic or freezing, and can't. And there's a phrase we say, can't, not won't. So knowing the child and where that avoidance is coming from is really important. And we have to take quite a lot of time investigating and figuring that out. The avoidance is about ordinary things that they can do or they want to do, but something just stops them, and then it becomes very difficult. So that's just one key feature. I'll rush through the other, but I thought it'd be really useful to give you an example of how we need to investigate it, really.
When we say that everyone can benefit from Team Teach training, we really do mean everyone. Our in-house training puts the emphasis on the unique needs of your setting and creates a consistent approach to behaviour across your entire organisation. Head over to the Team Teach website to find out more.
But the next key feature is around that often kids with PDA use social strategies. So on the surface, they can seem quite sociable. They often really like having friends and get along well with others, but they would then use those relationships to engineer getting out of demands. Sometimes it can be really people pleasing, giving things to other people so that they don't have to do it, following the crowd. Or it could be trying to control everything so that people do what they want to do. So it seems like, oh, well, they've got friends, they can't be autistic and all that kind of thing we have. But actually, when you dig down and listen into those friendships, you see that the child is just desperately trying to manage and control that situation to avoid that panic of a demand. That often goes with that lack of depth of understanding about social situations, because again, it's just too much demand on them to be able to create those depths of relationships.
Because that's what I was thinking when you were speaking, that it's not the what that I'm asking someone to do, the actual activity, task, whatever that is. It's just the fact that it's a demand and there feels like there's a requirement to do it, and that's where the difficulty comes.
Yes, it is. And anything can be a demand. Even kind of a choice is a demand, to have to choose something. There's demands on, like when you go into a room and there's a load of seats, the demand is you sit down on a seat. There's demands from even like choosing a meal or choosing what to wear, or demand from your own body. I need to eat now or go to the toilet. Those can be quite difficult. So it's a really digging down of where all these ordinary demands are causing so much stress. There's just a few more bits of the key features. One of them is a real difficulty with emotional regulation. It needs to be very excessive mood swings, which a lot of parents will notice more at home, because children with a PDA profile can still mask in school. that will exhaust them. And the kind of, this is where there is a link to autism in terms of the kind of passionate interests. I don't like the word obsession, so I think that passionate interest can get to the point where they get very interested in a person or a character, and sometimes they take on that character as a way of avoiding demands. I've seen this in a few children, and one girl I worked with said, when at playtime I pretend to be and act out these really confident characters from that I've seen on TV, and then when I go back into class I take on that role so I can cope.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of connection with role playing. If I be this role, I don't have to be myself, and this role can take on the demand rather than me. That is a feature for some children. And to be honest, that all this has been based on children who were verbal. And for those who don't speak, we have to look at other clues. And I think there's a whole area of research need to be done, and giving people the chance to communicate to us what it's like when they don't use speech, because so many, there's so many ways to communicate, isn't there?
There is, and I'm thinking about the strategies that I might try and come up with if I was working with someone that had a PDA profile, and a lot of those strategies would be communicative, and they would be about the language that I'm using. So it's interesting, isn't it, that actually it's quite hard in some ways to then think about someone that's pre-verbal and isn't able to communicate in the same way, about how that would apply. Is there much out there in that area, or is that somewhere that you think is developing?
Well, there's a huge need for it. I think there's just starting to beginning the sort of seeds of that growing. When I've done that in practice myself, we were able to adapt some of the helpful approaches. So they're not called strategies, they're called helpful approaches for PDA. And we were able to adapt some of them because they were active things. So, for example, we do things like we'd get two of an activity, and this member of staff would start doing one, and there'd be a set next to us for the child to come and join in if they wanted. Or, that kind of thing can be so helpful. But also, we knew that some children do understand a bit of verbal language, even if they can't use it. And I think some of the difficulties, though, is with using things like PECs or communication cards, because they're a demand.
Yeah, they are.
Visual timetables are a demand.
Yeah.
To do this and that order. So we need a lot of creative adaptation of what we do to entice and negotiate. And I think one of the biggest challenges for teachers is that we have to get rid of any kind of teacher-pupil role. Because it's got to be a very equal partnership between you and the child to come up with what are they going to do every day, because that's the biggest thing when a lot of children that I start assessing, I've ended up doing nothing most of the time.
Yeah.
And as teachers, we think, but we're just giving in to them. But if they really have a PDA profile, you're really not going to get anywhere by doing your traditional, even autism-based methods of support.
It's thinking outside the box, isn't it, and being attuned to that individual, because I'm assuming even though there is a generic understanding of what a PDA profile looks like, one individual with a PDA profile isn't going to have the same unique interests as another, and so we have to adapt, don't we, based on the person in front of us.
The most useful thing we start with is adapting the amount of demand to the tolerance of the child at that time. So there's a really helpful approach. It's in Ruth and Phil Christie's book about having like a 1, 2, 3 approach. So you start off with your core non-negotiables in a way that keep the child safe. So the child's really in a place where they're really struggling, their anxiety's up to the ceiling, and they can't cope with any demands at all. You take all demands away, except anything that creates safety boundaries around them. And you take away all your expectations that today or at this hour while they're in this place, we're not going to get anything done. We're just going to be with them and help them feel safe. and it's a nurturing approach. And certainly, and it's amazing when you start listening to yourself, how many things seem like demands, or we'll do that later. That's a huge demand. So there's a really helpful book that you can use around taking demand words out of your language, which is called the Declarative Language Handbook. I'd really recommend it. So we start with this one approach that number one is the heart of all we do. We keep the child safe. We help them stay regulated just by being with them, and we take away all demands. And the relationship between the adult and the child is really key at this point, because all the child needs to do at that point is feel safe. Then the next level is when the child's maybe a little bit more able to engage with you, is that we have activities that entice rather than demand. So there are options, there are project-based stuff that they're interested in, things that they can pick and choose to learn at their own pace. We might just let them watch and then, entice them in. So there's lots and lots of creative ideas of things that you can do in that way in the 2 books I recommended. And then the third level is where the child is really on it and fine and feeling that they can do stuff that day, and therefore we can build in a real educational program around that. But again, it still needs to be with their autonomy and their kind of direction to it. But that's where we can do some curriculum stuff. We can do some really good stuff around maybe self-esteem and emotional regulation and the teaching that they need at that time. Now, I'm sure loads of people are thinking, how on earth do you do that in a school? And I've seen some amazing schools do this, but what it really needs is a good team of teacher and TA, sometimes more than one TA around the child, who really get them, know the system that you're working with and work with it.
And I think you're right. It is, I've seen it work so effectively. And although I've never heard it named the 1, 2, 3 approach, I think I've seen services take on that kind of approach intuitively, and understanding that the relationship, safety, attunement is the most important thing at that point in time, and that stepped approach. And I've seen it also done not so well, and where we have some children that then get so anxious and find it really difficult to come into school at the other spectrum. So there's so much in that approach that you've mentioned, but I can't believe, Lynn, that it's already 20 minutes. So I'm gonna have to, I know I'm gonna
thing as I do.
Yeah, do.
A resource that can help teachers with this is called the PANDA approach, and it outlines all the helpful approaches, which are picked up in the books as well, and it's got a really handy poster that you can download as well. So I think that's a good way to start. But yeah, it's amazing how complex it is, isn't it?
But yeah, it is. I was like, oh no, it's the end now of it. But I think really the listeners are going to take away some really handy bits, even from the short snippet that we've done. So if we could just finish with 3 tips, Lynn.
Tip 1 is to really assess what is working for a child and what isn't, and do some really clear observations without assuming what's going on. Talk to the child, or get the child, if possible, to communicate to you what it's really like for them. So that's tip 1, really thoroughly investigate. Don't jump to conclusions. Number 2 is to have that 1, 2, 3 approach, because you can put your autism supports in there as well. And then the third tip is to learn some new language. Learn how to phrase what you're enticing the child into without using demand language. And that's a challenge, but really fun.
I know, but I've written down the Declarative Language book, because I think I could definitely use a bit of a refresh myself. I was thinking about some individuals that I support and for the staff around them. Yeah, so I've jotted that down. And thank you so much for your time, Lynn, and I'll catch up with you soon. You've been listening to the Team Teach podcast. It's been great to have you here with us as we discuss behaviour, communication, and the ways we can best support those in our care. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.